The dawn had not yet decided to appear when she heard the crunch of gravel under slow, heavy, almost ritualistic footsteps. Evelyn, accustomed to the cold silence of life on her farm, thought at first it might be an animal approaching the barn, maybe a deer seeking shelter. But when she looked out the window, she saw a human figure walking down the dirt road, slightly hunched, as if every meter traveled was a small but necessary battle. He was an older man, perhaps around 80, though the straightness of his shoulders made him look younger. He wore a faded green military jacket, cruelly weathered by time, an old beanie barely protecting him from the icy wind, and boots carrying dry mud from who knows how many towns before. There was nothing threatening about him, yet nothing that invited her to ignore him either. He was a silent presence, pulled forward by something deeper than the simple need for a place to sleep. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, crossing her arms to keep warm. He stopped a few steps away and lifted his gaze. Only then did she notice what she would later be unable to forget: his eyes. They weren't simply tired. They were eyes marked by war, by silences no one had ever been able to accompany, by nameless nights that still hunted him. There was in them a strange mix of discipline and defeat, as if he had spent his life obeying orders he never asked for and carrying guilt he never deserved. "Good morning," she said, though the sun had not yet touched the horizon. The man nodded slightly, reacting more out of habit than conviction. "I'm looking for temporary work," he said, his voice low, rough, as if speaking cost him effort. "If you've got anything, I can start today." He explained nothing more. He didn't say his name, where he came from, or how long he planned to stay. Evelyn, who had always been cautious with strangers, surprised herself by responding before she had time to think. "What kind of work can you do?" "Any kind," he said, without hesitation. "I don't need much. Just a place to sleep and something I can fix with my hands." That sentence revealed more than he realized. He wasn't a man looking for money. He was a man looking for purpose, looking for a place where his silence didn't weigh so heavily. As he spoke, she noticed that his hands, though strong and weathered, trembled slightly, as if the cold wasn't the reason, and in the firm posture of his back, the back of someone who had carried weapons, weight, guilt, there was an echo of a past that had never really left him. "I can't pay much," she said, still not knowing why she was accepting him. "The fence needs repair, and the ground needs preparing for the next season." He nodded once, without smiling, as if simply being given a task returned a small piece of him. "That's fine," he replied. Evelyn felt an inexplicable pull, a quiet certainty that this man had not arrived at her farm by accident. Something had brought him here, something that had not yet revealed itself. His eyes, broken, disciplined, surviving, stirred in her a strange mixture of compassion and respect. She pointed to the barn so he could leave his things, though he carried only a small backpack, far too light to contain an entire life. As he walked toward the barn, a small cloud of dust rose behind his steps, as if the past followed him even here, in this cold morning where the sun had not yet risen, but was about to illuminate what neither of them could yet imagine. From the very first day, Evelyn noticed something unusual about the old man. He worked as if silence itself were his companion, moving through the fields with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime following orders. He never asked what needed to be done. He simply observed, understood, and began. It was as if the farm spoke a language only he could hear. At sunrise, he was already outside, stacking wood, repairing hinges, sweeping the barn floor, tending to the animals with a gentleness that didn't match the hard edges of his face. He moved slowly, not out of fragility, but out of an almost reverent intention, like each motion carried weight, memory, purpose. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window during those first mornings, always with the same question lingering in her mind: what kind of life shapes a man into this? He never complained, not even when the cold wind cut through the valley or when the sun ashed the fields with bitter heat. He didn't flinch when lifting heavy bales of hay, though Evelyn suspected his back had endured more than any man should. Even when a rusty nail tore the skin of his palm, he wrapped it in cloth and continued working, as if pain were nothing but a familiar whisper he'd long learned to ignore. The animals liked him immediately. That was the first hint that there was still softness beneath whatever armor he carried. The horses approached him calmly. The old barn dog, who rarely trusted strangers, lay beside him while he mended the fence. Even the skittish sheep didn't run when he entered their pen. Animals sense things humans overlook: fear, danger, gentleness, truth. And they sensed something in him that Evelyn had not yet understood. But she also noticed the shadows, subtle but present. Whenever a tractor backfired or a door slammed unexpectedly, he froze. His eyes shifted as if scanning for threats that weren't there. Sometimes he turned his head just slightly, as though listening for footsteps, for voices, for echoes of a world long gone yet still alive inside him. He ate very little, almost mechanically, and when she asked whether he wanted more coffee or an extra portion of stew, he simply shook his head, always with a polite, "No, thank you." It wasn't refusal. It was restraint. As if taking too much felt dangerous or undeserved. The only moment he paused, truly paused, was at dusk. He would stand by the fence and look toward the horizon with an expression Evelyn couldn't decipher. Not longing, not sorrow. Something heavier, something buried. His silhouette against the fading light resembled a soldier still waiting for orders, even though the war had ended decades ago. One evening, as Evelyn walked past him carrying a bucket of feed, he surprised her by speaking first. "You run a good place," he said softly, still looking at the horizon. Quiet, honest. She hadn't expected conversation, not from him. "Thank you," she replied. "It's a lot of work, but it keeps me grounded." He nodded slowly as though he understood that better than most. "Work does that," he murmured, "gives the mind something to hold on to." Evelyn felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the truth in his voice. That simple sentence told her more than any long confession could have. This man wasn't escaping poverty or loneliness. He was escaping memory, and work, to him, was not a task. It was a lifeline. That night, as she watched him walk back to the barn with the same steady, determined step, she realized something else. He wasn't just working on her farm. He was holding himself together with every nail he hammered, every bucket he carried, every patch of earth he turned. He never complained, because complaining required vulnerability. And vulnerability was a luxury he had not allowed himself in a very, very long time. The jacket was the first thing Evelyn noticed about him, even before his voice, his posture, or the weight in his eyes. It was a faded green military jacket, creased, frayed at the cuffs, its color washed into a weary shade that spoke of decades spent in the open wind. It looked like an artifact, the kind of garment that had survived more than the man wearing it. Every morning, he put it on with a quiet ritual, as if the fabric anchored him to something he could neither forget nor fully face. And every time Evelyn saw it, she felt a pull toward the past he never mentioned. Some days, the jacket seemed heavier on his shoulders, as though the memories sewn into its seams weighed more than any bale of hay he lifted. Other days it hugged him like a shield, protecting him not from cold but from memory itself. Evelyn tried not to stare, but she couldn't help it. There were stains that hadn't washed out. One, near the left sleeve, looked too dark and too old to be mud. The fabric above the heart was slightly torn, not by a snag on barbed wire, but by something sharper, faster, more violent. Across the back, faint lines like shadows hinted at the straps of a heavy pack once carried, long distances. She didn't have to be a historian to recognize the truth. This jacket had seen war, real war, close war. Sometimes, when he worked, the jacket shifted just enough for her to glimpse patches where the original stitching had been reinforced. These repairs weren't recent. Someone somewhere had cared enough to mend it, to preserve it. Not out of vanity, its appearance was anything but presentable, but out of necessity or loyalty. Whose hands had sewn those stitches? What battlefield had torn them in the first place? Evelyn knew better than to ask. Once, as he dug holes for fence posts, the wind lifted the front flap of the jacket, and she caught sight of a small metal pin on the inside, rusted, bent but unmistakable. A military insignia. She saw the glint only for a moment before he pressed the fabric back into place, almost unconsciously, as if hiding a wound. That brief motion revealed everything she needed to know. He didn't wear the jacket out of pride. He wore it because he wasn't ready to take it off. It was the only part of him he seemed unwilling to set down at the end of the day. He left his tools on the porch, his boots by the barn door, even his hat hanging on a hook, but never the jacket. He slept with it folded neatly beside him, close enough to reach in the dark. Evelyn wondered why. One afternoon, when he finally removed the jacket to wash his hands at the pump, she saw the way his body reacted, as if the air itself stabbed at his exposed skin. His shoulders tightened, his breath caught, and for a moment he wasn't the quiet farmhand she'd hired. He was a soldier stripped of his armor in enemy territory. She looked away, giving him the dignity of pretending she hadn't noticed. When he slipped the jacket back on, his entire demeanor settled again, like a man returning to the only home his mind still recognized. That night, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table and whispered to herself, "He's not hiding behind that jacket. He's surviving. Inside it." But even she didn't know how true that was. Not yet. The past stitched into that faded green fabric wasn't just memory. It was consequence. It was unfinished. And soon, in ways neither of them expected, that past would come knocking at her door. The barn was quiet at night, quiet in the way rural places often are, where even the wind seems to sleep. But for the old veteran, quiet did not mean peace. And Evelyn quickly learned that silence could be the loudest torment of all. At first, she didn't pay much attention. A creak here, a mutter there. Old buildings made sounds, and so did old men. But soon the pattern revealed itself. Every night, just before midnight, his restlessness began. It started with shifting, his cot creaking under the weight of his turning body, as if he were trying to outrun a dream he couldn't shake off. Then came the whispers. Not words she could understand, but fragments of sentences spoken in a tone too tense, too urgent to belong to the present. Once, while stepping out to close the chicken coop, she heard him clearly through the half-open barn door. His voice was hoarse, trembling, and filled with a fear no man his age should still have to feel. Get down now." Evelyn froze. The barn light flickered above her. She felt like she was intruding on something intimate, something raw, like watching a wound reopen. Other nights, his whispers turned into groans, groans into gasps, and gasps into sounds she had only heard from animals caught. In traps. He never screamed, not fully. It was as if he had trained himself to swallow the terror before it reached the surface, denying it even the dignity of release. But the most haunting moments were the ones when everything went quiet. Too quiet. Evelyn would lie awake in her own room, holding her breath, waiting, wondering if he had finally found rest, or if he was reliving something so deep in his mind that he had gone utterly still. And then, suddenly, a thud. His fist hitting the barn wall, or the sharp inhale of a man returning from a place darker than the night itself. She wanted to check on him. Several times she almost did, but instinct stopped her, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some battles were not meant to be witnessed, even by kind eyes. And besides, she sensed that if she were to walk in during one of those moments, he would feel more exposed than if she had seen him undressed. Still, she worried. One morning, she brought him a cup of coffee and noticed a fresh bruise along his forearm. He said nothing. She didn't ask. But later, while feeding the horses, she saw a small blood stain on one of the barn beams, just big enough to tell a story she wished she didn't know. He worked as though nothing had happened, as though sleep were optional, as though exhaustion were a luxury he could no longer afford. But the fatigue showed. His hands shook a little more each day. His posture, once rigid and disciplined, began to sag at the edges, as if haunted nights were. Wearing down the armor time hadn't managed to break, and yet he never complained. Every night he returned to that small cot in the barn. Every night, the cycle repeated, the shifting, the whispers, the ghosts. One evening, Evelyn left a lantern outside the barn door, not close enough to seem intrusive, but close enough to offer comfort if he needed it. The next morning she found it moved a few inches to the side. The wick burned low. He had used it, just enough to see the space around him, just enough to remind himself he was no longer in the dark places memory dragged him to. But even light couldn't save him from his nights. Evelyn didn't yet know what haunted him, or who, but she sensed something undeniable. Whatever he carried into sleep was growing heavier, and the nights were slowly bleeding into his waking hours. And soon, the past he fought alone in the dark would find a way to confront him in the light. It happened by accident, like most revelations that alter the course of a quiet life. Evelyn had gone to the barn that afternoon to leave a fresh stack of blankets. The nights were getting colder, and though he never asked for anything, she knew he felt the chill more than he let on. He was out by the fence, repairing a gate hinge that didn't really need fixing, but which he insisted on tightening, as if keeping things in order was the only way to keep himself from unraveling. She placed the blankets on the cot, smoothing them out with a gesture that felt almost maternal. That's when she noticed the small canvas pouch tucked halfway beneath his pillow. It was nothing special at first glance. Old, stained, barely stitched together. But something about it felt personal. She knew she shouldn't look. Everyone has the right to private corners in their lives. But the pouch slipped open as she adjusted the pillow, and two metal tags tumbled out, clinking softly against the wooden floor. Dog tags. She froze. Time seemed to stop around her. Dust motes hung in the air like suspended memories. Even the horses outside seemed to fall silent. She bent down slowly and picked them up. The metal was cold, too cold for an object kept so close to where he slept. Weathered letters were stamped into the surface, some worn nearly smooth. Harold J. Hawkins, US Army OPOS Service No. Faded beyond reading. Her throat tightened. She had suspected he was a veteran, but this was the first confirmation, etched not in words but in steel. As she turned the tags over in her hand, something else slipped from the pouch, a small folded photograph. She unfolded it gently, afraid it might crumble. 3 young soldiers stared back at her, arms around each other, smiling with a brightness that felt painful. The world behind them was foreign. Sandbags, tents, a war zone frozen in an instant where hope still lived. And there, in the middle, unmistakably younger but undeniably him, stood Harold. His eyes were different then, alive, fierce, full of unbroken light. The other, 2 men. Something about them struck her. Their closeness, their happiness, the way they held each other like brothers, forged not by blood, but by survival. She wondered where they were now, or if they were anywhere at all. A wave of guilt washed over her. This was not her place. She refolded the photograph carefully and placed it back into the pouch. The dog tags followed, the metal clicking softly. like a heartbeat returning to the chest where it belonged. As she set the pouch back exactly where she had found it, she realized her hands were trembling. When she stepped outside, Harold was still by the fence, unaware. The sun cast a long shadow across the field, stretching behind him like a dark ribbon tied to his heels. For the first time, she noticed how heavily he leaned on his shovel between hammer strikes, how his breath fogged the air in uneven bursts. He looked older than she had thought, lonelier too. That evening, during supper, she watched him more closely. He ate in silence, as always, but now she could see something beneath that silence. A story, a wound, a promise unkept, a memory that refused to die. When he stood to leave, she almost called out to him. She almost said, "Harold, you don't have to carry it alone." But the words lodged in her throat. Some truths were too delicate to touch, some walls too fragile to lean on without breaking. So she let him go. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she saw the photograph again in her mind, 3 soldiers smiling before the world swallowed them whole. And she understood something she had not understood before. Harold didn't keep those dog tags because they reminded him of who he was. He kept them because they reminded him of who never came back. The night it happened was colder than usual. One of those nights where the moon seems too bright for comfort, illuminating empty fields and long shadows that move even when nothing else does. Evelyn had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of mending fences, sorting tools, and pretending she hadn't seen the dog tags she should never have touched. Sleep came slowly, restless, heavy, and then knock, knock, knock. A sharp, deliberate pounding jolted her upright, not frantic, not hesitant, just firm, unmistakably human. Her heart thudded in her chest as she reached for her robe. People didn't just show up at her farm, much less in the dead of night. She stepped carefully through the house, each creaking floorboard sounding louder than usual until she reached the door. Before opening it, she peeked through the side window. A man stood on her porch. He wasn't young, but not old enough to be mistaken for Harold's age. His coat was thick, well kept, with a military-style cut. Snowflakes gathered on his shoulders and hat, and in his hands he held a small envelope, worn, yellowed, like it had traveled farther than any person ever should. Evelyn opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The man removed his hat respectfully, revealing grey hair cropped short. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A man named Harold Hawkins. I was told he might be staying here." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Hearing his name spoken by a stranger in the middle of the night felt wrong, like destiny arriving too early or too late. "What is this about?" she asked carefully. The man hesitated, shifting his weight, as though the cold had seeped into his bones. "It's not easy to explain," he said, "but I've been searching for him for a long time." He lifted the envelope slightly. "I have something that belongs to him, something he was never supposed to miss." Evelyn felt the air around her stiffen. Her instinct told her to protect Harold, though she didn't even know from what. "He's asleep in the barn," she said finally. "I'll get him." But when she stepped outside, she realized Harold was already there. He stood several feet away, partially hidden by the shadow of the barn, his figure silhouetted in the moonlight. His green jacket looked darker than usual, almost black. His face was unreadable, frozen in a mix of dread and inevitability. "Harold," the man on the porch said softly, as if the name itself carried decades of unsaid things. Harold didn't move at first. His hands hung stiffly at his sides. Then he took a step forward, his boots crunching in the frost. "What do you want?" Harold asked, his voice low, stripped of the gentleness Evelyn had grown used to. The man swallowed. "I came to deliver this." He extended the envelope. It's from the family of someone you served with, someone who never came home." Evelyn watched Harold's chest rise and fall, slow, deliberate, like a man bracing for impact. His eyes locked onto the envelope, and for a moment he looked so old, so unbearably tired, that she felt something inside her break. "Why now?" Harold asked, almost whispering. "Because they finally found your name," the man replied. "They want answers. They want closure. And they deserve to hear the truth." Harold closed his eyes just for a second. When he opened them again, Evelyn saw something she had never seen before. Not fear, not sorrow, but surrender. He took the envelope with shaking hands. The man tipped his hat to both of them, then stepped back into the darkness, disappearing down the moonlit road without another word. Harold stood there for a long moment, the envelope trembling between his fingers. Evelyn stepped closer. "Harold, what's in that letter?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of a story he had carried for half a lifetime. "The past," he said, voice breaking. "The part I never wanted to open again." Harold didn't open the envelope right away. He held it against his chest, as if the thin paper could burn him, as if the memories sealed inside were too volatile to release into the cold night air. Evelyn stood beside him, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Instinct guided her to do neither. Instead, she simply remained, present, stable, a quiet witness to a storm she felt approaching. The moon cast a pale glow over the farm, illuminating Harold's trembling hands. His fingers brushed the edges of the envelope again and again, not in hesitation, but in resignation. The kind of resignation a man reaches only after running from something for so long that stopping feels inevitable. He finally exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that broke the stillness between them. "I knew this day would come," he murmured. "I just prayed it wouldn't." Evelyn spoke softly. "You don't have to open it alone." He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from years of holding them back. The vulnerability in his gaze startled her. It was as if, beneath all the layers of silence, discipline, and pain, there was still a boy who had once believed he would make it home with all his brothers beside him. Harold lowered himself onto the porch step, the old wood groaning beneath his weight. Evelyn sat next to him, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough not to intrude. With shaking fingers, he tore the envelope open. The sound, soft, fragile, felt like a wound splitting open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased and discolored from age. Harold unfolded it carefully, as though afraid the words might fade if handled too roughly. He read silently at first, then his lips parted, his breath caught. Evelyn watched the color drain from his face. "What does it say?" she whispered. Harold swallowed hard, his voice frayed like thread pulled too tightly. "It's from the sister of Michael Turner." The name left his mouth like a confession. He was one of my closest friends. One of the men in the photograph you found." Evelyn's heart clenched. She remembered the smiling faces, the youth frozen in time. "She says," Harold continued, "that she's been searching for answers for years, that she never knew what really happened to him." His voice cracked. "And she wants to know the truth, why he never came home." He pressed the letter to his chest, eyes closing as he fought something inside himself. "It was my fault," he whispered. "All this time, it's been my fault." Evelyn felt the words stab the air between them. She touched his arm gently. "Harold, war doesn't leave room for easy truths." But he shook his head. Not in disagreement, in despair. "You don't understand," he said, voice trembling. "He died because he stepped in front of me. Because I hesitated. 1 second, 1 damn second." His hands formed fists around the letter. "I should have been the one, not him." A tear finally escaped, not a dramatic tear, not a heavy sob, just a quiet drop, carrying decades of grief. He had a family, Harold whispered, a future, people waiting for him. I came back with nothing. Why him? Why not me? Evelyn's own eyes burned. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that soldiers don't choose which bullets find their mark. But she sensed such words would sound empty, even cruel. Some grief wasn't meant to be solved, only shared. Harold, she said softly, maybe they aren't looking to blame you. Maybe they're looking for closure, for the truth only you can give. He shook his head again, but this time it wasn't resistance, it was fear. I don't know if I'm strong enough to say it out loud. Evelyn took his hand, carefully, gently. You're strong enough to carry it alone for half a lifetime, she whispered. You're strong enough to let it out. Harold looked down at the letter, the moonlight reflecting off the worn paper. And for the first time since arriving at her farm, he didn't look like a wandering worker or a haunted veteran. He looked like a man standing at the edge of his own truth, terrified of falling, but even more terrified of continuing to stand still. Harold didn't sleep that night. Evelyn knew without having to check. Something in the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the farm itself sensed that a truth, long buried, was rising to the surface. Before sunrise, she found him sitting at the edge of the barn's open doorway, elbows resting on his knees, the letter unfolded beside him. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit, as if the weight of memory had compressed him into a quieter version of himself. He didn't look up when she approached. He simply said, in a voice rough from hours of silence, I read it again. Evelyn sat down next to him, the chilly air biting at her skin. What? Does it say? She asked gently. Harold exhaled slowly, as though the breath itself carried pieces of the past. She wrote that Michael's mother passed away, he said, never knowing the truth about what happened to her son. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She waited for answers that never came. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Harold, you couldn't have known. His next words cut through the morning stillness. I did know. He reached for the letter, smoothing it before, reading aloud, his voice trembling but determined. We were told Michael died saving another soldier, but the army never said who. If you are alive, if you are the one he protected, please tell us what happened. We aren't looking for blame. We just want to understand his last moments. Harold shut his eyes. When he opened them again, they glistened, not with tears, but with memories sharpened by decades of regret. We were ambushed, he began quietly. It was a routine patrol, nothing unusual. Then the shots came out of nowhere. His breathing hitched. I froze just for a second, but in a firefight, a second is everything. Evelyn listened without interrupting. This was not a story to fill silence. This was a story to survive. Harold's gaze drifted into the emptiness before them, as though seeing something she couldn't. Michael yelled at me to move. I didn't. I just stood there, long enough for the enemy to target me. His voice cracked. He pushed me out of the way. The bullet hit him instead. Evelyn felt the world tilt as if grief itself had weight. I held him, Harold whispered. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I saw the fear in his eyes, and the pain. And then he stopped, pressing a shaking hand to his forehead. I promised him I would tell his family he wasn't alone, that he was brave, that he mattered. He swallowed hard, the shame nearly suffocating him. But I couldn't do it. Every time I tried to write, the guilt swallowed me whole. I thought, if I stayed quiet, maybe the memory would fade. Maybe I could live with myself. Evelyn reached out, placing a hand gently over his. Did it? She asked quietly. Harold shook his head, tears finally sliding down his weathered cheeks. "No," he whispered. "It followed me. Everywhere, every farm I worked, every town I passed, every night I tried to sleep." He clenched the letter in his fist. "And now, they want me to tell them what I've been too much of a coward to face." Evelyn's voice softened, almost breaking. "You weren't a coward, Harold. You were a soldier, a young one, in a war no one was prepared for." He didn't answer. He just stared at the letter, at the past calling him home. After a long silence, he finally asked, "How do you tell a family that their son died because he saved a man who didn't deserve it?" Evelyn squeezed his hand. "You tell them the truth," she said. "Not to punish yourself, not to erase the guilt, but because his life and his sacrifice deserve to be remembered honestly, and because you've carried this alone long enough." Harold looked at her then, eyes hollow yet searching. "For half a lifetime," he whispered, "I feared this moment." "And now?" Evelyn asked. He closed the letter slowly, letting out a breath that seemed to empty him of decades' worth of torment. "Now," he said softly, "I think it's time to stop running." Harold didn't speak for the rest of the morning. He worked the fields with a hollow determination, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man walking through water. Evelyn watched him from a distance, resisting the urge to intervene. Sometimes the only thing a wounded soul needs is space wide enough to let the truth echo. By afternoon, the wind had picked up, brushing dry leaves along the fence line. Harold finally set down his tools and leaned against the post, his back curved, head bowed. Evelyn approached quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He accepted his cup, but didn't drink. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the restless rustle of the prairie grass. Then Harold spoke. "I never told anyone," he murmured, eyes fixed on the ground. "Not a single soul. Not for 60 years. Evelyn waited. "He was my best friend," Harold continued. "Michael Turner. We met during training. He was loud, stubborn, always cracking jokes. The kind of man who made you feel like surviving the war was actually possible." He paused, gripping the coffee so tightly his knuckles turned white. "The day he died. I wasn't brave, I wasn't ready. They always talk about instincts in war, how you'll react without thinking. But when it happened, my body just stopped. I froze. And he didn't." Evelyn's heart clenched. Harold lifted his gaze slightly, but not enough to look at her. "We were pinned down. Shots coming from the tree line. I heard Michael shout my name, but I couldn't move. Couldn't even raise my rifle." His breath shuddered. "He grabbed me, pushed me down, and then—" His voice cracked. A single tear slid down the lines of his face. I felt the impact through him, saw the moment his eyes shifted. The light dimmed. I knew right then that I should have been the one to take that hit. Evelyn placed a hand over her mouth, not to silence herself, but to hold back her own grief. Harold wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, ashamed of the tears even now. "I held him," he whispered. His blood soaked through my jacket. He tried to speak, maybe to tell me it wasn't my fault. Maybe to tell me, "To go home, I'll never know." The words never came. He closed his eyes and the world around them seemed to still. When we got back to camp, the officer asked if anyone wanted to contact Michael's family. Harold shook his head, shame flooding his expression. I said no. I let someone else do it. I told myself I was too broken, too young. But the truth is, I was too afraid. Evelyn stepped closer. "Afraid of what, Harold?" He looked at her then. Truly looked. His eyes were red, raw, and decades older than the rest of him. Afraid they would look at me and see the man who lived because their son died. The confession hung in the air like smoke, heavy, choking, undeniable. Evelyn felt tears sting her own eyes. She knelt beside him, touching his arm gently. "Harold," she said softly, "you didn't kill him. War did. Circumstance did. Chaos did. Michael chose to save you." He shook his head, but not in disagreement, in exhaustion. "I wasn't worth saving," he whispered. "That's the part I could never say aloud." Evelyn's voice trembled as she answered, "You were his friend. That was enough for him. And you've carried his memory, his weight, his sacrifice, every day since. That means something. That means everything." Harold closed his eyes, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, he let himself break. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like a man finally surrendering to the grief he'd buried alive, piece by piece, for a lifetime. He leaned into her, shoulders shaking, breaths uneven, and Evelyn held him, not like a savior, but like someone who understood that even the strongest souls need a place to fall apart. When the sobs faded, Harold whispered a final, trembling truth. "I'm tired, Evelyn. I'm so tired of surviving." And in that moment, the confession he had feared for half a century finally found its voice. Harold didn't return to work that afternoon. After his confession, he sat beneath the old oak tree near the edge of the property, staring at the horizon as though searching for a piece of himself he had misplaced decades ago. Evelyn didn't force conversation. She simply left the barn door open so he could come inside whenever he was ready, and then she went about tending the animals with a heart heavier than the pails she carried. As dusk settled over the fields, Harold finally stood. Slowly, deliberately, he walked back toward the farmhouse. The fading sunlight wrapped around him like a warm goodbye, illuminating the deep creases in his face, the quiet sorrow in his shoulders, and the jacket, the eternal companion he had never taken off for long. When he reached the porch, Evelyn stepped outside. She didn't greet him with words. She just offered a soft, steady presence. Harold lowered himself to sit on the porch steps, and she joined him. For a while the only sound was the hush of evening wind whispering through the tall grass. Then Harold spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I always thought the jacket kept me safe," he said, brushing the worn fabric lightly. "But I think it kept me trapped." Evelyn glanced at him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. He was simply honest. "I wore it every day," he continued, "because it was the last thing Michael touched, the last piece of the life we shared. I thought if I took it off, I'd lose him forever." She understood now. The jacket wasn't a shield. It was a memorial, a burden, a confession he couldn't speak. "Harold," she said gently, "you don't honor someone by punishing yourself." A long silence followed, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the rhythmic beat of Harold's unsteady breaths. Finally he nodded, barely, but enough. With trembling fingers, Harold unbuttoned the jacket. The motion was slow, reverent, almost sacred. Evelyn watched as he slid it off his shoulders, the fabric falling into his lap like a heavy exhale. He folded it carefully, smoothing the edges the way a soldier folds a flag. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. When he was done, he held the jacket for a moment, neither clinging to it nor pushing it away. "It's time," he whispered. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand over his. "You're not alone," she said. That was when Harold broke again. But this time, the breaking was gentle, like ice thawing in spring. A release, not a collapse. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the folded jacket. Tears slipped silently from his eyes, falling onto the fabric that had carried so much fear, guilt, and memory. But unlike before, his shoulders didn't tense, his breath didn't stutter. He cried as a man finally unburdened. When he lifted his head, the sorrow was still there, But so was something new, space, light, the smallest flicker of peace. Evelyn took the jacket from him and held it in her lap. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked softly. Harold looked out at the farm, the land where he had worked silently, where he had wrestled his nightmares, where he had finally spoken his truth. "Let it rest," he said. And so they did. Evelyn walked with him to the barn. Together they placed the folded jacket on a high shelf, beside the lantern he had used during his darkest nights. Not discarded, not hidden, simply set aside. That night, Harold slept without fear. No whispers, no fists hitting the walls, no ghosts crawling from the past. Evelyn checked on him at dawn, expecting to find him awake as always, but Harold was still asleep, deep, peaceful, his chest rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of a man who had finally laid down a burden heavier than any war. The farm in its stillness had set him free, and Evelyn understood then that sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures or loud revelations. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in truth spoken aloud, and in the simple, profound act of finally letting go.